Welcome to this video. It's been a little while since I've posted, and you see that now I have an intro. I'm doing the 3-voice counterpoint. This is going to be the last video. As you see from the title, it's moving on from the whole note cantus. Okay, and the title basically says it all, but this is the reason why I want to make this last video on 3-voice counterpoint. And one of the main reasons why I want to make this and also stick on 3-voice for a while is because you're going to be using 3-voice counterpoint more than you may realize, and a lot of times even 2-voice counterpoint. Furthermore, it is good to focus on each individual one separately so you know how to actually compose for each one in different circumstances. That's the whole point of the species approach, so I've been teaching that on my channel. I went through the species for 2 voices, I went over the species for 3 voices, and now I'm moving on from that, still doing 3 voices, but this is free counterpoint. So I'm going to have a few guidelines and ideas and also examples. And I'm going to also share with you some things like how to write a cantus. There's going to be a lot of things in this video. We're also going to look at some music, Beethoven piano sonatas, and we're going to see how oftentimes Beethoven wrote with only 3 voices, or a lot of times only 2 voices if it's a very fast passage. And this might be idiomatic to the piano instrument, but it's good insight to know that this is a writing style that is good to know how to accomplish. Okay, and before I actually get into the main content of this video, I'm just going to go over the main ideas that I'm going to go over in this video. I'm going to give you some ideas that you can follow to make this not sound so much like an exercise, make this sound more musical, but at the same time follow certain guidelines so you'll be able to accomplish this at ease and also make it sound contrapuntal, because we still want to hear the different voices, and we don't want to get carried away with certain things. And I've thought about this for quite a while, so I'm going to share some of the things that I've thought about with you right now. First, motifs are fine, but they should be kept short and to a minimum when we're thinking about the exercises here. When we start actually writing a piece of music, well, we can do whatever we want, but this is talking about the exercises. And as you see from my example, I'm normally somewhere in between maybe 6 bars on the minimum, more likely 8 bars or something, anywhere up to the longer ones, maybe 12 to 16 or 18 at the longest of a counterpoint response. If I really want to practice something, maybe a 16 bar response will be good. But if I want to go through many different styles and maybe even want to do different keys and minor, major, maybe even different modes, then I can have, like I have here with this 7-bar example as you see in the first line, and that can be perfect because then you can finish it quickly, move on to the next one, and you can get a lot of experience at the end. So make sure you don't get too tied up in any of this. I'm just going to throw this in there before I forget. There is an option that you could think about chords, but you don't have to. You could just fill in the counterpoint response. You could kind of think like a modal approach, or you could think like a tonal approach, or what a lot of people do, and I do, a hybrid approach where you think, okay, I want to think about harmony and chords, but sometimes I want to think melodically, and I'm just going to follow sort of a modal counterpoint approach to have good counterpoint in this situation, but not focus so heavily on I have to do this chord or that chord. It's good to have some variability in what you're doing. The next one is good. Clear cadences are a very useful skill in music. Okay, when you have a clear half cadence, when you have a clear perfect cadence. And that goes on to the contrast of it, that it's also useful to use cadences that aren't very clear. It's good to use cadences in general, and if you're thinking about older style music, what people call classical music, but it is a blanket statement, so it covers a lot, but you're going to be oftentimes thinking about cadences melodically or within one voice, better said. So you can think about soprano cadences and the bass cadences, tenor and alto cadences, and how those voices not just follow the exact cadence like a tenor following a tenor cadence, but how those different voices create cadences within the music. Like if you listen to a lot of Bach, you hear a bunch of cadences, but then the other voices keep going. That's a really big part of Bach's music, and I love that. The next would be polyphony, but also harmony and beautiful moments. Okay, so you want the polyphony, you want to hear each individual voice, but if you only focus on that, you might not have certain moments where you have some harmonizing. You might not have a beautiful moment, which might include togetherness, aka parallel motion. A lot of times you're going to be doing parallel thirds or parallel sixths, okay? But if you listen to a lot of music, you'll hear some composers doing things like parallel fifths, parallel octaves. And we're taught not to do that, but I think we should practice doing that and seeing what it sounds like, and seeing for ourselves if that's something we want to completely exclude, or if maybe there's certain situations where that might sound nice. Maybe certain situations it'll lose one of the voices. Okay, like we've been taught, you might lose the voice because it might get lost in the overtones. So it's good to know these things, but it's also good to know, well, what does that sound like? If I always tell myself I'm never going to do a parallel fifth or octave, I might be missing out on a certain tool to make a certain sound in my music, and I'm just completely avoiding it because of certain rules. Okay, so we're going to see like a string of parallel thirds, I'm pretty sure, in one of these examples, and if not, I'll write one in one of these videos, and we'll see what I'm saying with the moments of togetherness. Okay, so we'll see the counterpoint, each individual line, and then here we only have 3 voices, but we could bring this on to 4 voices and further, to where, let's say 2 of the lines are moving in parallel thirds, let's say, and they're creating these nice string of thirds, and if you know parallel thirds and parallel sixths, they're very easy to follow each of the different voices. You can very distinctly hear it's 2 different notes creating that nice interval. So contrapuntally, it's still easy to follow. It's just not conventionally an approach that you're going to be thinking of doing a string of parallel thirds or something like that, but it can sound really nice. Next would be each part should be interesting, each line, each voice, and that should be on its own. It should be able to be followed on its own, and it should sound nice on its own. So I'm also going to go over that in this. We're going to listen to each line on its own, and it's not saying that each line has to sound like wow, or like that actually sounds like something I want to listen to, or it sounds super interesting, let's say. It doesn't have to be like that. It just has to sound good. Like, okay, that sounded pretty good. That didn't sound bad. And maybe that did sound kind of interesting. And it could be better than that, of course. But at the base level, you just want it to sound all right by itself. You just want it to sound not like there's a moment that doesn't sound right, or something that sounds like it's drawn out too long or awkward. That's all you're looking for. It sounds good enough. And then you put it all together, and then the end product sounds a lot better when you pay attention to each line and you maybe iron out some of the bumps that might be on the individual line. I'm actually going to write some parallel fifths and parallel octaves for the piano, some strings. We're going to listen to what it sounds like. We're going to familiarize ourselves with the sound of it, because whether we look at it as a neutral thing or good or bad, however we look at it, it would be good to actually be able to know the sound of this, and not just a fifth or an octave, but the parallel fifths or the octaves, and really know exactly what that sounds like. Next, I'm going to be going on to making your own cantus. So a lot of times this will be a bass line, or it'll be the soprano line like a melody, but it's also good to do an alto line or a tenor line. Of course, it's very useful to be able to write a alto or tenor line and be able to harmonize around that and figure out a method that works. Oftentimes, no matter what line you write the bass line after that if you didn't already write the bass line, and then after you write the bass line, you often write the soprano line. So that's normally the order. No matter what you did, you kind of cross those out first, and then you fill in the middle lines. And a really important one is that you have an end product that you enjoy listening to. Here with my channel, this isn't like you're turning in an assignment to a teacher and they're grading you. This is me giving you some advice, and I have the practice examples that you can download. If you look at the descriptions of each of my Counterpoint videos, you can fill them in yourself. You can email me a response if you'd like to. You can see I have some response videos, but this is all for you. This is your personal improvement as a musician, and maybe you might call yourself a contrapuntalist, as some people might call it, but it's just music. You're just a musician. So that ties into the free counterpoint here, okay? You're doing whatever you want. You're making it for yourself. You're making something that when you listen to it, you say, that sounds good. You're not necessarily writing something that you're trying to have other people listen to and say it's good, unless that is your goal. But if that is your goal, it's good advice to know. I've heard this from other people plenty times, is that other people will personalize with things that you personalize with. So instead of trying to make something that you say, oh, the person's gonna like this for this reason, or I hope people like this because I'm trying to make this like the music other people like, or something like that. Instead, if you write something that you personally enjoy yourself, a lot of times other people will personalize with that, or it can oftentimes be a deeper felt connection of hearing, okay, I can actually tell the person made this out of enjoyment. And with all this, now with the responses, we want it to be more musical. We want less of an essence of an exercise. When you listen to it, you don't want to hear, oh, that just sounds like another counterpoint response exercise. Instead, you want to listen to it and say, oh, that actually sounds kind of interesting. And maybe hold on to that for later and put that in a song or something. Something a lot of composers did, and a story of a lot of composers, is they would write a lot of melodies or parts of pieces or individual passages. And let's say even when they're going to their symphony, they would find a lot of things that work together, and they would start putting them together, working with them, of course, probably varying them a little bit, making them work or whatever. So it's good to be able to do that. And now we're going to be getting closer to that because, as you see, we're getting away from the whole note cantus. So I'm going to share some methods of first starting with the whole note cantus and then embellishing that. And then also things like you see I have the quarter note cantus and some other things. And now at this point with the free counterpoint, you need to practice things like breaking rules, sacrificing certain rules for certain expressions, such as, okay, I'm doing a leap of a seventh. I was told that's not the best in counterpoint, but if I do a leap of a seventh, I'm going to fill in the chord tone that is not in the other voices, and it's going to make a full chord now. But if I don't do a leap of a seventh, then my only choice, if I want to do another chord tone, is to create another octave. Okay, so in that case, simple thing like that, a lot of people might laugh and say, well, why does the leap of the seventh matter? And it just has to do with the very basic rules of learning counterpoint. It was saying to not use a dissonant leap, and that was just the very basic, trying to learn how to write a coherent counterpoint exercise that fit in the key and coherently worked in the key that you were using. Now that we're going to free counterpoint, we're going to be doing a lot of things that we wouldn't be doing in the beginning, but those lessons in the beginning are really good because they're at the very foundational base level of understanding all this. Along with sacrificing certain rules for expression goes along with modulating to certain keys, having motifs to actually have a melody in your song or an interesting moment that then gets repeated. Additionally, sequences and harmony. Of course, one idea that's good is doing combined species. You can have quarter notes in your top voice, and you can do suspensions in your middle voice, and you can do half notes in your bottom voice, just for an example. And you're mixing 3 different species in each of the voices. I didn't do a video for that because I've done so many responses and so many videos that you don't want this to get boring and redundant, and you don't want to get tired of this. You want to enjoy this. So that's just an idea. You could always practice doing that, and especially when you get into your free counterpoint writing. You could do an entire response like that, or you could even do a passage to where, again, you have species that you stay strict to in each of your voices. And of course, florid counterpoint is also one of those options. We want to be practicing melody writing and creating chords with that melody. Okay, because a lot of times in these responses, we're not thinking about, okay, creating a nice melody, but now we're oftentimes going to be writing a melody, and that is going to be our cantus that we're going to be working with. That is our given melody. That's what a cantus firmus is. Okay, so it starts getting more realistic. Oftentimes you're going to write a melody, and then you're going to figure out a bass line that works for that. I've been showing approaches of writing a bass line and then writing a melody over that, and I think that's really good, but that's going to limit you in your melody. You're not going to be able to write whatever melody you want, but if you write whatever melody you want and then use that as your cantus firmus, now you can harmonize that. And then you're going to be practicing creating chords with the melody. And with a melodic chord, oftentimes it's going to be vertical. So you have to think about, okay, how am I going to make this chord? And oftentimes you can do something that's kind of clever, like you can write out an arpeggio of a chord, and then when the first 2 notes of that chord are playing, it's in that chord that the arpeggio is highlighting. And then once it gets to the last note in that arpeggio, you could use that note and harmonize it with a different chord. And it's little things like that that create interest to the ears, because you're hearing that arpeggio of one chord, but it's harmonizing into another chord at a certain moment. That's just one idea. And then you got to implement styles and methods of composers that you enjoy. And a lot of this is going to be listening and hearing that and then trying to recreate that on your own. But of course, there's scores. So you want to be doing some score reading. It's also good to do some rescoring. Maybe think of your favorite piece or a piece that really inspires you and maybe rescore the entire thing. Maybe rescore a movement or a page, or maybe even just a line. Whatever it is, it's going to do you a lot of good, and it's going to get you a little more into the mind of the composer. And you're going to see a lot of the composers, a common thing is you go, okay, the idea of it or the overall structure of it is simple. It's not super crazy, but it's very clever. And it's something that often I wouldn't think about, or other people often wouldn't think about. And it's a very humble moment when you realize that they're just using two chords, but they're doing this extremely clever thing that you would have never thought of doing. And then you start changing the way of thinking how you want to compose. That's why score reading is really good, and also rescoring is really good. From there, you want to analyze the scores, of course. That's like score reading, but it's a little different than actually sitting there and analyzing it. And you want to try to internalize this stuff and to actually be able to think about it from your head. Walk away from the paper, walk away from the instrument, walk away from whatever tool you have to be able to help you visualize this or hear this or whatever it might be, and be able to create it in your head. Of course, it starts simple with chords, circle of fifths, keys, random things like that, but then it goes on to thinking about actually composing. Okay, think about a line in your head and sing it on the sheet music if you are visual. If you're not visual, you may not be able to do this, unfortunately, but you can do other things. If you're visual, this is for you, and you could think about a line of music in your head on the sheet, and then you can start to, it's a brain exercise. You think, okay, keep that there. And you got to understand what you just thought about. And then you have to fill in the other notes. And you can start to think about a little piece, a little passage, or you can just think about ideas. Oh, I could always do this with that voice and this with that voice. And you can just, you can go on a walk and practice counterpoint in your head just because you want to. And ultimately, this is going to lead to an ability to write music with or without an instrument, which it's good to be able to do both. I think most of the music that I write is without an instrument. I personally like to just be able to think about it in my head and then be able to write that. But I'm starting to write more with an instrument because I'm realizing that I'm actually not as good at that. And this is not all about being able to do one or the other. Of course, this is about being able to write the music that you like, being able to write the music that at the end of it, you are happy with, that you're satisfied with what you created. Okay, and the last point I want to say is that there's going to be a point in this musical understanding and in your music process to where you are going to have to take any questions that you have. And I don't mean that literally, of course. You can still ask some people. You can ask me if you want, but there's going to be a point to where you're going to kind of have to buckle down and say, okay, I have these questions, and I'm going to have to figure out the answers myself. And a lot of times you're going to have to figure out without researching. You're going to have to think about everything you've been taught, I'm saying at a certain point, and be able to connect dots and make sense of things. Maybe write things down on paper. That's where you're really going to be understanding this stuff. Okay, because that's you figuring it out on your own. And figuring out how to solve these questions is going to engrave the lessons that you learned within you. You're not going to forget about it. And then furthermore, teaching what you've learned to other people is going to help you internalize it even more. And trying to explain a topic to someone reveals how much you really understand it or how much you don't. And from there you realize, okay, maybe there's a certain gray spot in this that you didn't even realize. You thought you really understood this, but you can't explain it really coherently to someone. And I believe when you can explain something coherently to someone, and even further, if you can simplify it, make it really understandable to them, then you really understand the topic at hand. Okay, before I get into the example, I'm going to show two examples from Beethoven sonatas. First, we have the first piano sonata, and pay attention to the tempo. It's an allegro, so we do have a faster tempo here. Of course, you can listen to it. I'm not going to be playing it for copyright. But as we can see, if we move on to the next pages, okay, we do see some 4-part counterpoint. We do see some 3-part counterpoint. Okay, so just solidifying the fact that it's good to know your 3-part counterpoint. But if we start to move on to some of the faster passages, okay, we're going to see a lot of 2-part counterpoint, okay? And of course, you're seeing a lot of arpeggios here. So you're seeing a lot of different chord tones, and like when you hear that vertically very fast, you're going to be hearing a lot of chords. But the whole point is you're going to have to know to write for 2-part counterpoint if you want to write lines like this, like Beethoven did. And you can see furthermore, it goes from the 2-part counterpoint when it's a very fast passage, and even some of the bass notes are still slowing down, but he's still keeping that 2-part counterpoint. He's not even going to 3-part counterpoint. And it's kind of interesting what the two voices are doing. See, after the first measure, we have just the bass, and it looks like it's going away from the soprano. It's going down, and then we see it's in the very bottom line, so kind of just like the bass and the tenor. There's no actual soprano is the better way to say it. There's not that top line. Then we see we're ending down there, but then there's a note on the top. Okay, and then we move on, and then, whoa, what's this? We see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 note chord with a cluster in there. Okay, and it's at fortissimo. This is Beethoven's very first piano sonata before he even started doing anything super crazy. Okay, so we should all learn from this. Some people think, oh my gosh, you did a 5-note chord. Here's Beethoven doing his 8-note chord. Okay, followed by a 7-note chord. Okay, so we see a lot of ambiguity with the 4 voices, and a lot of people think that a lot of these musicians wrote strictly 4-voice counterpoint. People think the 4-voice counterpoint is the be-all and say-all, but if you notice a lot of music that is written in maybe the chorale style or in the contrapuntal format to begin with, you will see that a lot of times people are doing 3-voice counterpoint structures. They might fill in a 4th voice for some support, but it's not always going to be there oftentimes. Sometimes people always do 4-voice counterpoint. Some people just write that way. But I don't think it's the be-all and say-all to where you always have to do 4-voice counterpoint. It's going to be always the best. And you might actually have an experience like me to where I think if you want to write a very coherent contrapuntal line, 4 voices is a challenge. But it's a lot more coherent for 3 voices if you're going to compare the two. And of course, you could take that to the extreme of 2 voices, but you could see where I'm getting at that. If you take away a voice, you can hear the other voices, and I think 3 is almost the limit to where you can really completely follow the voices. Once things get into 4-voice counterpoint, for me, it's really hard to completely follow some of the voices. I know some people can do it no problem, but I think for most of us, it becomes more difficult. So you want to think about that when you're writing. Because, of course, like I've been saying, oh, you're writing for yourself and you want to write music that you like. But, of course, you're wanting to write music that other people can listen to, too. So you're wanting to think about the listeners, okay? Okay, we're just going to look quickly at the Sonata 21. Pay attention to the tempo again. Okay, and we're going to move on, and we're going to see a lot of the 2-voice counterpoint, okay? We do see some 3-voice counterpoint. We do see some notes in the lower voice, an interesting device. But we see that in these faster passages, you don't even see 3 voices. It's strictly 2-voice counterpoint, because what else are you going to do if you're playing? Of course, like I mentioned, this is idiomatic for the instrument of the piano, because the player's playing with their fingers, but it's good to note that this is a writing style, just simply 2 voices. Okay, here we are with some 3-voice counterpoint responses. I'm going to briefly describe them to you. We're going to listen to them, and then I'm going to go in depth a little more on how I wrote it, and structures that you can follow to write your own. First off, we have 80 beats per minute. I think it's good just to keep it nice and slow when you're trying to listen to the individual voices here. The whole point of this is to try to follow each of the voices, but also, like I was saying, try to actually start making it sound more musical. We're starting off with a quarter note bass cantus. So here in the bass line, we see only quarter notes. We also see it's in a 3/4 time signature. Okay, so it's one idea too. Practice different time signatures. So I labeled a 9th leap, okay, and then I labeled a few chords. And I think that was because I was probably doing dissonances on the strong beat, and that was a way of me remembering what chord I was maintaining. So that first line is one response. Okay, the next one after that is an embellished half-note bass cantus, just doing the bass for now. Embellished, I mean that I started by just doing half notes. And I'm going to go over how to write a cantus. And on a basic level, it's very simple. Of course, you can make it more complex if you want. But the idea here is that I only had half notes, and then I added other notes kind of in the middle of that, on top and below or around it, and made it more melodic. And also the thing to where, as an individual line, it sounds good by itself, along with the other lines, where we see each of the lines has its own character. Okay, but here in the key signature, we see this one is in C major, but we see here an accidental in the 3rd bar here, and then we see it says A major, D major, G major, C major, and that's the different keys. So we go from C major, I go all the way to A major, and then I go backwards the circle of fifths. So A major, D major, G major, back to C major. We're going to see these different things combined, especially the modulation, add some interest. And then just the last of these responses that I'm going to show you as an example before I move on to teaching you how to write the cantus and just filling in some stuff real time here in the video. Okay, so this one is an embellished whole note bass cantus. So just like the last one, this one started off as a whole note versus the last one like the half note, and then I embellished it. And we see this one ended with no whole notes versus the very end, which I'm always ending with whole notes. So I embellished everything, but the whole notes acted as an idea in this one, and then I was able to furthermore add some different notes when I was writing the rest of it. And here's what I was talking about. We see a string of some parallel thirds, okay? So we see 1, 2, 3, 4 thirds that are in these eighth notes, and we're going to see how it creates a nice little musical moment. So that's this response. Now let's give them all a listen. Okay, so there we have it. You could see each response had its own style. And you could also see that here in the first example, we only had the quarter notes, but it still wasn't very boring, especially because the top voices were very busy. And something good to know, that you might want to actually use this device. It actually has a certain style to it when you have a stream of quarter notes, something written above it, or one of the voices is just doing quarter notes. And you probably wouldn't do this for an entire song or something, or maybe not even an entire passage, but you might just do this for a certain phrase. Okay, before I get into writing the cantus and writing the responses, I'm going to go through some ideas and guidelines and a few cantus that I already wrote just to give you some ideas. The first idea is a simple one, and that is you start with a melody, then write a good bass line. For this one, I'm thinking find something familiar and good to work with. Or a step further, I'm doing a folk melody. So think of a folk melody or maybe a nursery rhyme melody or something like that. Something that really registers with people, that people familiarize with, and try to be inspired by that and try to just make your own melody. Here I was inspired by Camptown Lady, a folk melody, and it's influenced, of course, a lot of times people are going to be singing it not realizing what key or what time signature they're in. So the notes actually fitting in the key and then actually playing in time, not people being kind of confused of when to sing and what note to sing. It's probably going to sound a little different than regular, and I don't know exactly what the Camptown Lady song is. I know it's pretty simple, and I think most of the time it is sung in C major. So that was another idea. And then here's some freely written cantus, just to give you some more ideas. I wrote one in E Phrygian. I was just thinking about being in E Phrygian, and I was just playing on my piano. We see on the bottom, this is how it was originally written. Then I transposed it in the bass line down some octaves, so I could respond to it as a bass line. I'm not going to go through the burden of having you listen to these because they're going to be pretty boring. But if you want to write these down yourself and respond to them, these are some ideas. I think the more important thing though is how did I write this? How did I get to this? And that's what I'm sharing with you. So this one, we see I put in 3/4. I thought, why not practice something in a 3/4 time? Again, I was just on my piano thinking, okay, I'm in a 3/4 time. And then I was just thinking about arpeggios. And I was kind of thinking, okay, I'm going to do like a certain sequence, and then I'm going to add a little variation in that. And then also I'm not going to only do that sequence, but I'm going to add something interesting in the middle of that, and then try to keep that as a sort of structure in the piece furthermore. We see with that I have the sequence of the 2/8 notes and then the dotted quarter note. We have that twice. Then next I have 2 dotted quarter notes. So that's taking up that moment of time. Next I have the 2/8 notes and the dotted quarter note again. We see it shifted up to a different chord than before. Then next we see we just change one note, but we actually are going to a different key momentarily. We're going back to the key we started on, but going to a different chord, and instead of this sequence going up those 2/8 notes and then landing on that dotted quarter note, now unexpectedly you have 4 more eighth notes. So instead of it pausing, it brings you up and it keeps going, and then you reach a sort of climax up here to where you have that dotted quarter note holding this out, and then like before we had 2 dotted quarter notes, but this time we have what is taking up the span of a dotted quarter note, but it's just a quarter note and an eighth note. The eighth note's acting like the passing note, and then again we see a little bit of nuance to where we have 3 eighth notes and the dotted quarter note, versus in the beginning the sequence was the 2 eighth notes and the dotted quarter note with the eighth note rest. So just these little things are adding some interest, but they're playing off of the original, but they're not doing exactly what the original did in terms of melody, harmony, sometimes key, chord, and all together. Okay, so it's adding some variation, but then when it adds some variation, it's playing off that. That is a structure or a device you'll see. Like we see this measure of just eighth notes is then repeated on the second line right here. Then we have something we didn't see here. We have a quarter note and 2 eighth notes and another quarter note. So adding this variation in the melody is going to keep the listener on their toes more, because what you're doing when you're repeating certain things, you're adding some familiarity. The listener's being drawn in to say, okay, I can follow this. But then when you're bringing that to a place to where they're not expecting you to take them, that's going to want them to listen to it more or be surprised, and it's going to be a better experience musically. Okay, so now I'm just going to go over some ideas and we'll fill in a few of these. So first, I have an eighth note cantus. You could just think, okay, I just want to write an eighth note cantus. You could put it in time signature you want, in the tempo you want, and you can write it however you want. It's just the idea of doing a given melody, giving yourself a melody, writing yourself a melody using only eighth notes. So that's why following certain structures here, it's still like doing a counterpoint practice, and of course, like I showed in the beginning ones, it was just free counterpoint. So that's why I'm offering this, is because you might realize that when you follow a certain structure like only doing eighth notes, it actually has a cool ending result. And these are little devices that you're going to be able to use when you want to actually go to compose. And that's why it's good to isolate these things, because you're also going to now know how this sounds, and one day you might think, oh, I want to make this certain sound. Oh, I know to do that, I'm just going to write eighth notes in one line, and then I'll write suspensions in the line below that or something. It'll give this certain effect. So it's good to know stuff like that. Next will be an arpeggiated cantus. This could be anything. Are you going to do quarter notes, eighth notes? Is it going to be based off arpeggios with some freedom? Or are you going to do strictly arpeggios? And it'd probably be good to practice both. Again, you'll hear a certain sound from doing the certain thing. Here's another one, a modulating cantus. So try to modulate 2 times. A lot of times a piece will modulate 1 time a little bit and it'll come back to the same key, but try to modulate at least 2 times in an amount of space. So let's say you give yourself 10 measures and you have to modulate twice in that, and that might seem pretty simple on paper, but to make that sound good and come up with an end product that you're happy with might be more challenging than you expect. And if not, then perfect, you just got some good practice and now you know what you can do. Here's an interesting one. Like Debussy, a whole tone cantus. He often wrote with the whole tone scale. The whole tone scale is very interesting because when you only have whole tones, you only have major thirds. And when you have chords with only major thirds, you only have augmented triads. And things can get a lot more spicy when you get into the 7th chords. But it's very interesting to write for the whole tone scale, because it is a limited transposition scale, one of the limited transposition scales created by Olivier Messiaen. And what this means is you can only transpose it a limited amount of times. For this one, you can only transpose it from where you started 1 other time. If you start with a C whole tone scale, then you can go up to a C sharp whole tone scale, no problem, and you're going to have different notes. So now you have 2 different scales. But if you go up to a D whole tone scale, you have the exact same notes as you started with your C whole tone scale. And because of that, it is a limited transposition scale. And you only have those 2 actual scales to work with. So it's very interesting, as you can imagine. Okay, so how do we actually write a Cantus Firmus or a given melody? Well, we can do this many ways. As you know, oftentimes it's a bass melody that you're given, or it can be in the soprano, hence the given melody, but it can be in any voice, as you might have seen with some of my practices in the previous episodes, that we can put the cantus in different voices and then we can respond around that or above that, below it, whatever it is. But of course, we want to write our own music. That's the whole point of this. So now we get into writing our own given melody. And from this simple foundational idea of how to write a simple Cantus Firmus, you'll be able to brainstorm more in how to write a stable foundation for your ideas, for your pieces, or to write a given melody that is coherent to the key that you're using, which can be very important. Especially if you're wanting to do a lot of modulations and stuff, it can be very good to coherently hear that key that you're in, have strong cadences, and so on. Okay, so let's get into writing this. I'm actually going to show you in real time how I'm going to write a whole tone cantus. I'm going to keep this pretty simple so you can brainstorm ideas off of this. So one of the simplest things that we can do to showcase the key that we're using is to highlight the triad of the tonic. So here we see the sharp on F, we see an F sharp, so we're either going to be in G major or we're going to be in E minor. I'll just go with G major, and there's only 9 measures here, so I'm just going to stick with G major the whole way through. I'm not going to modulate to anything. You could, but I'm going to keep this real simple because the point is how to write the cantus. Okay, so we're thinking about G major. Oftentimes we see the given melody in the bass, so it's a bass line, you write above it. But if we're writing our own music, you're going to have a lot less boundaries writing the melody that you want when there's no bass line underneath it, limiting you and telling you what you have to respond with, especially when you're trying to follow the rules of counterpoint here. If you're just starting off with the given melody, you can write whatever you want in the melody. So let's do that, and then I'll write the one after this in the bass. If you aren't used to reading the treble and the bass, it really is pretty simple. And once you get used to it, you actually will not really think about it very much. You'll be up here in the treble, and in your mind, you'll just think about the notes up there. You won't think about it any more than that. And then you'll see the notes down here getting more in the bass, and you'll know the notes that correspond down there. It really is just something that if you practice enough, it becomes a second nature. And then you get furthermore into reading things like the alto staff, which is very important because a lot of people just make a piano score and transpose it into different instruments, and that can be a good writing style, and that can serve as a good template to have a kind of consolidated version of what you're writing. And then you also see where the voices are in their registers. So then you just put that into the instruments, everything's good. But the problem comes when you want to edit something, when you want to add something. And if you aren't familiar with reading the alto staff, we got to know these staffs aren't just telling us the notes, they're also telling us the positions, just like we see with the bass staff and the treble staff. So when you start getting familiar with the alto staff, you get familiar with not just the notes you're seeing, but where those notes are in the register. For example, the alto staff, the middle of it would be the middle of the bass and the treble staff, the middle C. So when you start to understand that and you can read that, then you're able to know where that voice is. You can limit things like voice crossings, or you know when you're doing a voice crossing and you actually know what you're doing. That's the whole point. You actually know what you're doing, and you're going to kind of burden yourself if you don't learn how to read your staffs. Then you get into the tenor staff and so on, and you might think you may not need to learn how to read that, but once you start getting into writing for certain transposing instruments, that's going to come in handy to be able to read these different staffs and know where they lie on the registers. Okay, so we're in G major here. We're going to write this Cantus Firmus. I'm going to stick with a whole note cantus, and I'm going to show you how you can write a whole note cantus like oftentimes we're given, and then we can choose to embellish it to make it more interesting. Okay, so again, I'm going to keep this real simple for this one. We're going to highlight the triad of the tonic. So G major, we're going to have G, B, and D. If we add the 7th, we're going to have F, and I'm not going to highlight the 7th as a chord tone, but I might add the 7th when I begin to embellish it, which that 7th of the tonic is going to be the leading tone. So I'm going to use it as the leading tone, which again is going to reinforce the key that we're in more. Okay, so let's get into it. We're thinking about whole notes. So it's pretty simple. What's the first note that we're going to start off with? Well, we might start off with a D, or we might want to have a 5th above that. It can be very good to have an instrument with you so you can say, okay, what does an octave sound like? What is a 5th going to sound like, especially in this key? But it's good to know that anyone can train relative pitch, whether you have perfect pitch or not, you can have relative pitch. So for example, I can look at where I'm probably going to be in this register. Here, I can look at this D note here, and I can say I'm probably not going to use that D note. So I like to separate by over an octave. So instead I'm going to choose this D down here in the bass. And here in MuseScore, as you can see, you can hear that. So now when I hear that note, I'll think about that same note, but an octave higher. And of course that would be here. I'm going to transpose it even an octave higher than that, but it's just the point of the interval that we're going to be choosing. And that's just the same note an octave higher, so I don't know if that needs much explaining. But then think about the same note a 5th higher. And well, how can you do this? Well, think about the Star Wars song. And that first, the bun, da, that's the fifth. I may have not done that perfectly, but that is the interval that you need to hear in your head. You think about the Star Wars theme, and when you think about that, you could think about, okay, the sound of the fifth, the sound of the octave, and the whole point of this is the good starting note. Okay, so I am starting up in the soprano here area, or up here in the treble staff, but I can click on this note, and I could think about the Star Wars song. Okay, so I think what would be a good note to start with? Would I want to do that note or the fifth above that? And of course I could just write the fifth above that, but the whole point of this is to kind of train your ears a little bit. Okay, so we'll listen to the fifth above, and then we'll listen to the octave above in the register that I want. And nothing against the octave, but I feel like in comparison, it was a little more dull versus hearing that fifth. Okay, so that's the fifth above D, but I don't know really why I did D, because we're actually in G major here. Okay, but you get the point. Training your ears to the interval. I'm going to start a fifth above G major, because I'm still going to keep with that same idea. I want to do a fifth above the tonic to start with that note. So actually, funny enough, I'm going to start with D. And now I'm only doing whole notes here. So when I think, okay, with whole notes, I still want to highlight that tonic triad. So now I'll just go down to B, and then the next note I'll just go down to a G. So there's a descending tonic triad. Pretty simple, but as you can see, that's the overall foundational structure of this, which then we can embellish, we can add some stuff to. So if I do the seventh of the tonic, or in other words, just in the key that I'm using, if I use that seventh degree, I'm probably going to use it as a chord tone of one of the other chords. So we think about using the chord built on the fifth scale degree, and the third of that chord is going to have the seventh scale degree. So we could always include it like that, but I'm probably not going to be using anything like a leading tone yet here in my cantus, because when I go to embellish it and add some embellishments, maybe a passing tone, maybe a neighboring tone or something like that, that's where I'm going to include that seventh when I'm trying to highlight this tonic chord here. So it's going to be more of an embellishment that's going to include that note, but it's not going to be built on the chord tones. So it's not going to be an official, in my eyes, seventh chord. And generally when I am doing the cantus, I'm not really thinking about seventh chords very much. I'm thinking about possibilities of seventh chords and when I could harmonize that later, but I'm generally, when I'm writing a given melody, I'm thinking 1, 3, 5 of chords. It could be in different inversions, but I'm generally doing the triad. I also like to add some ambiguity here. Okay, so we just did the G. We did the G, B, D, but we did it backwards, D, B, G. And now instead of thinking about chords too much here, because we could think about chords all day when we start to actually harmonize this with the other voices, we could just think about some notes. One thing I like to do is add a sixth above the tonic, or at least include that note, so then it adds some ambiguity, because when you add the sixth above a note, then it's going to imply possibly an inversion. Okay, so since we're just doing whole notes here, let's do that. So from here, I go to the G, I'm going to go up to the B, and you might say, okay, I'm doing a lot of leaps here, and that's because I'm not going to keep this as a whole note cantus, I'm going to embellish it, so it actually would be good to add some leaps. But then again, thinking about how a whole note cantus is normally written, maybe I'll add, after this leap, some more stepwise motion, and that can be a little more of a challenge to embellish, but it'll add a more interesting end product that's not just the same thing over and over. Okay, so we think sixth above G. There's many ways you can think about this. You could look at it, you could know it in your head quickly, or for me, I like to either look at the sheet music or just think a third below E, or if that doesn't come quickly to my head, sometimes I'll just think a fifth plus one. So G, B, D, E. Okay, so we have the leap of the fourth there. And now because I did that leap, I'm going to descend down. And the note that we land on is the D, but instead of just going down another third and doing more leaps, I'll go down another step, I'll do the C, and then I'll go down to the B. And then from the B, I'm going to go to a G, but instead of just going down a third and being kind of boring, I'm going to leap up to the G here, which is also going to tell us that we're going up to a higher register. And if I follow this through and put the bass in a lower register, that's another good device to tell us that we're at a certain point, maybe a comma, a pause, or here it'd be the ending to this passage. So I'm keeping that in mind, and I'm also keeping in mind that I'm doing the tonic. So I'm doing the G, and with that, I'm thinking of doing a soprano cadence in the soprano voice, and then thinking about filling it in with a perfect authentic cadence, having the bass voice then move down from the fifth to the tonic. So there's that clear cadential ending. And again, we have that leap, but I can fill that in and have that be the soprano cadence. So let's start off by doing that. It's often a good idea to finish the cadence early off, or maybe even one of the first things that you do will be finishing that cadence. Okay, so I said I wanted a soprano cadence, so I'm going to put F there, which is then going to go up a half step to that note G there. So we have that leading tone. We also have the B going up to the F. So there might be some multiple things going through your head right now. I don't really know. You might think, okay, we have a B, and you probably don't want to use the third of the chord, especially in the second to last measure. You probably want something like a 1, 4, or 5. And if we're going from the B to an F, then if we were doing a G, that'd be the 7th chord. But it's also good to keep in mind, well, we could have 2 different chords in here. We could have a 1 chord in the first 2 beats, and we could have a different chord in the other 2 beats, and I think I'm gonna go with that. So I'm just gonna leave this how this is right now, and depending on what I write, I might add some more notes. I might just keep it these half notes, because it's a good device to use to have a slow ending and oftentimes a slow beginning. So the listener will hear that slow beginning, it'll start to pick up some speed, and then all of a sudden things will start to slow down again, and you will have the ending. Sometimes even the composer will repeat similar things, or maybe even note for note what was in the beginning and then what's in the end, so that really expresses the fact that, okay, I'm hearing this again, and that was the beginning, now it's the end. That's another good device. Okay, so we have the notes filled out. I know it was a whole note cantus, but the point of this was to show you an embellished whole note cantus. So I already started embellishing the second to last measure. We have all the other whole notes filled in. We have a foundation now that tells us the tonic triad, and then again with the leap of the 4th that gives us the 6th built on that tonic. It's kind of a mouthful. In other words, just the 6th built on the tonic there. That's giving us a little bit of ambiguity because it's in the context of what might seem like it's building up to a G chord. And then if we put the E at the top of a G and a B, all of a sudden it looks like an E first inversion triad. Again, it's good to fill in that cadence, so I'll just complete it. And I'll think about, okay, where am I going to end here in the bass voice in the last measure? So like I said, I want to do the bass cadence, which is just a 5-to-1, because I have the soprano cadence and the soprano 7-to-1. Of course, you don't have to stay strict to that, but I'm just doing a simple, perfect, authentic cadence. So I'm going to go down to G, and like I was saying, I could spread it out further in the register, so it signifies the fact that it's going to be the ending. And then now putting these notes here, now I'm going to have a clear direction on what I'm going to have to do leading up to that. Okay, I'm not just going to all of a sudden end here at the end and go, oh, actually I want it to go out in the register for it to sound a certain way, and to actually say, okay, this is the ending strongly. But all of a sudden now, let's say you already wrote notes and they're going way up high, okay? So that's why it's good to fill in the ending oftentimes. And oftentimes it's good to fill in certain points and not just go beginning to end. Okay, so with that we see the note G, we think an octave below, another G. We think an octave below that, another G, but that's not good enough for me. I'm gonna do an octave below that, and I'll do the G down pretty low here in the bass staff. Okay, now I'm gonna be going down a 5th to get there. So if I just think going up a 5th, is going to be the 5th top of that tonic note. Now we have the 5-to-1 cadence. I oftentimes like to label my cadences. So here I can do the fingerings of the notes, and I'm just going to label, that's a 5, 1, I'm going to get the point, just a label in my head. And then again here, I'm going to do a 7 to a 1. Okay, and now in all realisticness, if you want to fill this in and you want to have a good end result, the more time you spend on it, the better the end result is probably going to be. Of course, there's a finite line where you can spend too much time and start to go crazy or something. But you can look at this kind of like you're carefully sculpting something, or carefully drawing a nice picture to where you're doing the foundation, and then you're adding some details on top of it, and then you're adding in finer details in the middle of that, and you're taking your time, and you're not just doing it as quick as possible to have some end result. You're trying to write music here. So you want to spend some good time. You want to write something that you're happy with at the end. And if you spend 2 days writing something and you're really happy with it versus trying to spend 2 hours on something and you think, I mean, it's listenable, that's a big difference. So my whole point is it'll take a while if I want to do a good response here, or at least it'll take more time the more quality work that I want to put into it. So instead of spending a bunch of time doing a response, I already have enough videos on that. If you want to see my counterpoint videos on the several videos for the 2 voices, and then also if you look at my counterpoint with triads video part 3, there I go through 3-part counterpoint in 2nd, 3rd, and 5th species, along with a lot of other tips and useful things in the video, including 7th chords. And there you will see me actually go through every single species, filling in the notes. So that's very helpful. So check those out if you're curious, if you want to see filling in the notes and you want to see some ideas. Even if you think you know what you're doing, you could probably gain some ideas from just watching a video of someone else doing something, because they're probably going to think of stuff that you didn't. So I'm going to think about this like if there were the other 3 voices, like if I was filling this in, but I'm going to spare the burden of taking too much time to prove my point. So I'm going to think in the context if I was filling in different voices, and I've done it enough to know that one of the first things I'm going to do is want this voice to stand out in a certain way, because the whole point of this is to do the counterpoint. So the first thing I'm going to do is change that whole note in the first measure to a half note, which has a half note rest before. So the bass would come in, and then the half note would come in. And now I see a space of a third between these notes, and there's the half note to the whole note. Of course, I could turn this into 2 quarter notes. I could add a simple passing tone. For now, I'm just going to leave it how it is and move on. Okay, and again, this is your given melody, so you can write this however you want. And with that, I'm going to try to add something that's maybe motivic or add some familiarity to it. Try to add something more musical than just responding to the notes. The responses in the beginning are good because you're not thinking about all the extra stuff and you're just thinking about the counterpoint. But as you start to write your own music, of course, you want to actually write something that's interesting. So with that, I see that I started with the half note rest, and then I go into a half note. And in my head, I think, well, it might be kind of interesting if then I add some quarter notes, maybe 2 quarter notes, let's say, on beat 1, 2, and then I have another half note after that. And then after that, maybe I'll pick up some speed as I start to go towards the climax, the high point, or possibly like a roller coaster, I'll add some slow suspense going up, and then it'll quickly go down. Let's see what we're going to do. I'm going to change this into a quarter note, and since I leaped down, I'm just going to use the simple device of going back up after leaping down. These are very conventional approaches to composing, but they have nice results. Of course, if you use these too often, all these devices, you will have a rather cheesy end result because you're following so many of the rules. It just sounds so in tune, and it sounds so much like, let's say, a major scale, that it doesn't have the expressiveness or the dramatic feeling that you could have if you start to split away from that. Of course, I'm trying to be simple here, but just some food for thought. Of course, I wanted those quarter notes. Now I'm thinking about doing a half note again. Now here's where I could look at a few different things. One being the measure before, and 2 being the measure after. First, the measure before, we see I already have the D up in the register, to where if I put this in the next note up, like it looks like where these notes are headed, I'm going to end up on that D again. Okay, but look at the next measure afterwards. I see that it's going down pretty low in the register compared to where I am right now, and I was already considering what if instead of going to the D up here, if I did go up to a D, but I went an octave down to add some more interest for the listener, to say, okay, well, you knew it was going to go up to that note, and it did, but it went down to the note down here. And now just another thing to think about is that if there were notes below this passing tone here, the second beat here in measure 2, this quarter tone, would probably be a dissonant passing tone. And if it was, then you probably wouldn't want to just leap down to the note that you're going up in strict counterpoint, although that is something that I often like doing, and I like the sound of it. I think it sounds really good. So there is that, but the point is that there's no notes underneath at all. There's nothing underneath that's telling me I have to write this note or that this is a dissonant note or anything. These are just notes for now, and what I write underneath it is going to then tell me if it's going to be a dissonant or how it's going to correspond. So that's the freedom of writing a given melody yourself. Okay, so moving on, I went down to the D here, and I want to get somehow to the B here. Of course, I could do another leap if I want, but this is a melody, so I want it to be more melodic. So this is where your ideas can start to shift. In the beginning, I was saying, well, maybe I'll do 2 quarter notes and then a half note. And that was the foundational idea, so that's what I did. and now looking at the measure after it, I'm saying, maybe not so good of an idea. So this is where you start to adapt. So I just went down to a leap, and I'm thinking about doing some eighth notes, but it probably wouldn't sound very good just to go up, just to start to ascend, go down a leap to eighth notes that start to go up again. So thinking about that, I'm going to change this to a quarter note, just like the other notes. And then after that, I'm going to add 2 eighth notes, and look at that. And that fills in the span of the fourth between the D and the G. Okay, so we already see it's starting to get more melodic here. And at the end, we'll listen to an end result. But for now, we're moving on to the third measure. Everything was very stepwise leading into this measure. And again, with the eighth notes, instead of starting off the beginning of this measure doing more eighth notes, which could be kind of nice, okay, it keeps going. We're in the very beginning, so I still want the listener to be able to really recognize the fact that this is a 4/4, the time signature that we're in. So that I'm going to do another quarter note. So it has a little bit of a pause, so we hear that full beat in its entirety. It's going to be a lot easier to follow. And then here's where you don't want to get too boring. So from here, I could think, okay, well, there's only one note away. And I mean, the most simple thing you can do is a dotted half note and fill in that entire span. Of course, it's probably not what you want to do. I probably want to do a sort of leap that ends up into this note. So thinking about that, I'm going to go towards the end here, and I'm going to fill in the notes leading into the next measure. Then I'll be able to fill in the gap in the middle of that. Okay, so we see the next measure, the note B. Again, I'm thinking about the given melody here, so I don't need to think about chords too much. I always could think about chords, but for this sake, I'm mostly just going to be thinking about notes. And then when I fill in the other notes, of course, I could think about chords however long I want to. Okay, so again, I probably want to leap, and then I want to end up going down into this note, descending, so I want to end up somewhere above this note. I'm thinking instead of ending with the eighth notes again, to add a little bit of more ambiguity, add some more interest, then I'm just going to end with a quarter note here. Okay, so I'm just going to do a step above this next note here. And I also want to do some eighth notes in the gap that I just created here now. Okay, and I could continue to think backwards. So, of course, if I'm filling in 2 eighth notes, I'm going to fill in the first one and then the second one. As you see, if you're actually writing on a sheet of paper, you can literally go backwards any notes. That's why it's good to write on a sheet of paper a lot. I love composing just with pencil and paper. It's, I think, one of the best ways. And again, this is my given melody. I was just creating the foundation, so I can do any leaps that I want to. I could say, okay, well, I think I want to do a leap up here to the A, maybe. In my case, I actually don't want to do that. I'm just going to leap up to the tonic note. So that's another good device to use, is that when you have a high leap, a climax, or possibly your highest note, often the point's just the climax, a high point that's often going to be drawn out a little bit, use the tonic triad, or at least a interval that's going to be consonant with that tonic triad. Of course, here this is a small passage, so this is where this is really going to come in handy, because the whole point is, okay, in this small passage, the listener's going to be able to tell what time signature we're in, be able to follow that, be able to tell what key we're in, be able to follow that. And then thinking about following, I'm doing these little things to make the rhythm more followable too with the time signature as well, by paying attention to where I'm putting the notes, where I'm putting longer durations of notes. Okay, so I'm going to choose the note G, and we do see that's a leap of an octave. So in terms of strict counterpoint, everything is still checking off. And now we see, compared to the whole note cantus that we started with, things are getting a lot more melodic. It's also good to note that you're probably going to have other voices in here as well. So I'm just filling in the given melody. And this is actually another method you could just use for creating a given melody, where I created the foundation, then I'm filling in the notes. It's actually turning out to be a really good way of just creating a melody. But you can also use this when you're filling in all 3 voices at the same time, to where one of your voices might just be whole notes for a foundational idea. Oftentimes it's going to be your bass, and from there, as you're filling in the other notes, you're going to think about how the notes in the bass could be filled in a little more above, below, around, to make it more expressive and to correlate and communicate more with the other voices. Okay, so there's both those methods. Okay, and we do see we have some eighth notes here. So in terms of the half note in the beginning and the quarter notes, just to give some contrast, the eighth notes are the rather faster notes in this scenario. I do see that we're coming up to the 6th leap. And of course, this is the foundation. So am I going to keep it a 6th leap? I already just came back from a leap, so I might make this more gradual, or maybe I'll push this whole note here over to the end of the measure, to where it's just going to then go down a step into the measure after that. I might go a bigger leap, or I might change the direction of this completely. So of course it's just the foundation, but it works as a very good method. And again, we want to add some interest. We also don't want it to be anything we can suspect too much. So let's pay attention to what we did. We started in the upper register. We went down a little bit, but then we leaped down, and then we quite drastically went back up, and now we're going back down again. Okay, so we could go back down and be in the lower register again, but then we're kind of just going up, down, up, down. Why don't we hang out in the upper register a little bit? And we do see that would work nicely with the notes after this. So I'm thinking because this went up an octave and then it started to go down, why don't I kind of play into that a little bit? But instead of doing an octave, I'll go up a tenth. And like I was saying, I'll shift this note over. Realistically, it's probably going to be a quarter note, so I'll just make it a quarter note for now. This first beat of the measure here, I'm also going to turn into a quarter note. And I'm actually going to figure out the note that I want for my high point. And I think because I want to highlight the tonic triad, G, B, and D, and my last high point was a G, why do I then do the fifth? And literally, I'm going to be a fifth above my last high point. And we do see the last high point occurred on beat 2, this one's occurring on beat 1, so there's a little bit of some difference there, and these little things are going to make it so it doesn't sound just so boring, it doesn't sound so perfectly, like what some people describe as Mickey Mouse. Everything's in the correct places. The beat is exactly how you expect it. The rhythm is exactly how you suspect it to be. Okay, so we want interest here. Now I said I wanted to do the leap of the 10th, and I'm going to stick with that. So I think, okay, what's a 10th below this? Or I could just think a 10th is an octave plus a third. So I think, okay, the third below this is a B, and a B an octave below that is right here, except I was supposed to put that right there. Now we see something interesting. This measure is now starting with a B and ending with a B. There's nothing wrong with that. I actually think it's a little bit of a challenge sometime to say, okay, so I'm going to end and start this measure with this one note. How am I going to make this interesting in the middle of that? And I do want to stick with these two quarter notes, okay? So I'm just going to rely on outside of this. I've been doing a lot of stepwise motion where I have a quarter note and then stepwise motion with eighth notes after that. So I still want to do some eighth notes, but why not include a leap? Again, it can be good to work backwards. So I'm actually going to think where I'm going to end up in beat 4 here, and I'm going to want to go up 2 steps to end to that note before I go up that 10th leap, just so I'm not doing a bunch of leaps around. And with that, I could go up some more steps and fill it in backwards from there, just steps, step, 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 but that's a little bit boring just doing those 4 steps in a row. So why not add some more chord tones in here? Let's see the notes that I'm working with. I have the B and the D. So I'm actually going to start on a D. I'm going to go up to an E. That's going to leap up to the G, and then we have the D. So if we count the strong beats, we at least have a D, a G, and a B. So it'd be GBD, which is the tonic chord. And then we also have the E in there, which then leaps to the G. So there's a little bit of something in there where your ear might catch it and kind of think about an E 7th chord. Of course, that would be an E minor 7th chord. Okay, so we have that filled in. It doesn't go completely up steps, but we have those eighth notes going ascending up. It reaches the quarter note. We have the leap of the 10th, which plays off the fact that we had the leap of the octave before. Okay, so I'm not putting too much thought into this, but I am putting thought into this, so it actually turns out a certain way, and I'm not just filling in notes. You'll see that when you put thought into it, then you listen to it at the end, you can sort of hear those thought processes if you pay attention to it. Okay, so I had a leap of a 10th, and of course with that, I want to respond by going down probably stepwise, or at least something that is close to that. But of course, that's exactly what we're going to suspect, because that's used very often. Your ears kind of suspect that if you do a big leap, you're probably going to go down. So we already did what the listener suspected before. Why not now not do what the listener is going to suspect? So if they are suspecting something, we're going to surprise them. Again, I was saying going up the 6th is a good device when you're highlighting the tonic triad, because it adds some ambiguity, saying, okay, now we just went up to the 6th above the tonic, so now we're doing a chord built on the 3rd scale degree, and it adds that ambiguity. Okay, so I'm going to go with that, and instead of going down after this leap, I'm going to do what you probably don't expect, and I'm going to go up another note, 1 note higher. So this is actually going to be my climax. Just like oftentimes if you're going on a roller coaster, you keep going up, 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 might flatten out a bit, and sometimes you have a little more. You keep going up a little more after that. Okay, so that adds to the suspense. Of course, now we see we're way up here, and I mean, right after this, we see we're trying to get way down to here. At least that's the placeholder I have. I could always change this. This is my given melody. But we also probably want to get down lower just because of where this is heading after this. Okay, now to get down here quicker, it might be nice to add some 16th notes to fill in some more of those steps. And it's good to note that if I'm doing 16th notes here, then when I'm filling in the other voices, I should probably add some 16th notes other places, so there's not just a random stream of 16th notes somewhere in this passage. There's a quality of very good songwriting where the songwriter keeps in mind every little detail that they add to the music that they're creating or writing, to where every note or melody is going to then be a call maybe to another response, or it's a response to something else that called, or it's going to serve motivically somewhere else, it's going to show up somewhere else, or it's just going to respond to something else. So there's always attention that's paid to every little detail. And this is in really good songwriting, I've noticed. It's a very common quality. So what I'm getting with that is, if you add a certain thing, you should add it, what some people say is at least 3 times. So if you add some 16th notes, you should have 3 different times throughout this where you add 16th notes. Of course, you don't have to be strict to that, but it adds the coherence again to where it doesn't just sound random, but actually sounds like it's a part of it. Okay, so enough rambling. I'll fill in the other notes. So I want to do the B and the G because I went up to that E there, and now it's going to furthermore highlight the ambiguity of that E chord. And I'm thinking about adding some more interest, so I want to add a 16th note, but instead of adding the 16th note right after the climax, that can be rather harsh, having the quarter note and all of a sudden just going into the 16th notes. So instead of doing that, I'll keep this an 8th note where it's at. I'll change the next note to a 16th note, and I'm actually going to shift that up now, so then I can add these 2 16th notes that are going to add a little more flavor in this, instead of just having the quarter note, 8th note, quarter note, 8th note. Now we have 2 16th notes. It's also helping the fact that we had the climax, we went way up high, and now we're kind of quickly going back down. Okay, and like I was saying earlier with the cadence, you oftentimes don't want to end up in a place to where you're at the end and you aren't quite set up and things aren't quite matching up in the registers. Okay, so with that in mind, I already have the second to last measure filled in. I'm going to now go to the third to last measure, because other than that, I have the fourth to last measure right before that. So I'm just thinking, okay, I'm going to fill in this third to last measure, which again is preparing me towards the end where I'm probably going to want to slow down. I've had a lot of these 8th notes and this 8th note, quarter note pattern. So with that, I'm thinking I at least want the last 2 notes of this measure just to be quarter notes, no 8th notes. And maybe I even want this whole measure to be quarter notes, but that might be kind of boring. So I'm just going to keep that in mind for now. I'm going to do the thing where I shift the note at the end because I know that's the note that I won before I go to the next measure. Part of the reason why I want to stay strict to this is because it's going down that step. It's not only that, but after that, I go up this leap of the 5th. So I'm just thinking, okay, it's going to be good to have some stepwise motion before a leap. And let's kind of follow what we've done so far. Okay, so we start in the upper middle register of the treble staff. We go down towards the middle, we go back up, and then we start to go a little bit below the treble staff, and then we leap all the way above the treble staff. We end up towards the middle again, then we go from below, and now we're pretty high above the treble staff here compared to where we were before, and now we're going back down, and now we're in the upper middle again. And remember, I was saying the thing of we kept going up and down, and we can really see that now. I was saying, why don't we hang out in the upper register a little bit? So let's do that. So I'm going to do something interesting here. I'm going to do an E going up to a G a third, and then it's going to leap down to a B. So if you aren't quite following, I have E, G, B, the chord, and I've been adding the E for some ambiguity that's been around the tonic chord, and now I'm highlighting that chord again. Okay, so it's showing up. Like I was saying, it's good to pay attention to every detail and include it and to think about it. So here's that E chord again, and this time it's actually being spelt out. So before you kept saying, is this an E chord? Is that an E chord? I don't really know. Your ears might be saying that, and now your ears are going to be saying, okay, this is an E chord. Could always add some ambiguity with this. Will I do that? And no, just instead of doing only quarter notes, I'll just add these 2 8th notes, so there's the passing tone in between that E and that G there. Okay, now I just have the fourth to last measure here as a whole note. And of course, I don't just want this to be a whole note in the middle. So let's fill this in. In this case, I do want to have this D note, but I don't know if I want it in the beginning, at the end, or the middle. I don't really know. But I do know I want to include it. So I'm just going to put that note in place throughout the whole measure, just so any point I can use that note. And I'm just going to shift the other notes accordingly, maybe fill in some spaces. Let's see. So I can think about chords, but I'm mostly going to think about highlighting the tonic triad. Okay, so here's what I came up with. I just wanted to include the note C because of where it was in the register, how it didn't quite fit in with the G chord, and then also the fact that I kind of wanted to stay in this register. I didn't want to keep leaping up and down so much. So to stay kind of in the middle of the register a little more, I just chose the C. From the leap down of the third, the measure before, it leaps down a fourth, so we have some leaps there in a row. So because of that, I added some stepwise motion going the opposite way up, kind of recovering from those leaps. And oftentimes that is something where if you have 2 leaps in a row, it's almost extra good to recover in the other direction because you're doing a bigger interval most of the time and you're just leaping twice in the same direction. So it's if you want to respond to that. Of course, if you want to throw off the listener and not respond to it, then that's why it's good to know what the listener might expect. Okay, but we see the other thing that I stuck with is the quarter note, 2 eighth notes, 2 quarter notes. And I did the same thing in the next measure. So adds a little bit of motivity just in the rhythmic value. And then it's kind of nice having that before it ends. So it has these 2 repeating little things with the slowed down quarter notes. And then we actually slow it down to 2 half notes. And then we end. So of course this was just the melody, the given melody. And this was good because I showed a way to where you can actually just write a given melody, starting from whole notes and embellishing it. And with this, you could also imagine to where you could do this, like I was saying, as you're filling in the other voices, whether that's 2 voices to begin with maybe, or you're doing 3 voices all at the same time, or maybe even 4 voices all at the same time. Everyone has their own method. It's often good to do the bass first, but it's also often good to fill in things as you go. So experiment, figure out your method that works for you. It's probably going to depend on the situation that you're in, but if you practice a bunch of things, you're going to have a bunch of tools in your tool belt. For any situation that you're in, you're going to have something to do. And with this is training you to not have a roadblock or not have writer's block, as they say, where people don't know what to come up with, because if you don't really know what to come up with, you're not feeling creative. You could just pull some of these tools out of your pocket and create something, which is the approach of instead of having to just sit down on an instrument or think of a line of music somehow and to be able to produce that, we're going in a different approach to where we analyze what makes up a melody most of the time, what creates a melody. And there's so many things that go into that. When you start to understand that, which is oftentimes the foundation is just built off chords and chord tones, then you are able to create your own melodies by sort of sculpting them. And I just look at this as a different method. You could sit down, you can create melody as you're playing an instrument with your voice and try to replicate that writing down. Or like I'm saying and I'm doing here, I'm just thinking about not the laws, but sort of the things that you can conceptualize and pick up on when you read a lot of music and study melodies. And I'm implementing that here when I'm writing my own. So it's a very good technique. And what this technique is writing without an instrument, which is what oftentimes people think the gold standard of writing. I just consider it a different writing method. I think it's really good to also write with an instrument, but if you compare the both, I oftentimes have different results. So that's why I think they're just different. So let's listen to the end result of this given melody, which it wasn't really given. We created the given melody, but we're giving it to ourselves. Okay, so a few things. In my opinion, it was a very clear ending, and there's a few things that helped out with that. One is just the perfect authentic cadence. We associate that with a lot of endings, so it just sounds like, okay, well that's an ending of something. And also the registers are quite far apart, which is often a common trait to the ending of something. And then if you also notice, like I mentioned, those 16th notes sounded kind of random, but that's because we don't have any other notes filled in. So that's the kind of point that I was talking about, to where if you include something that you didn't before, we had quarter notes, eighth notes, and then the 16th notes were kind of random. So if you are responding with the other voices, if you're filling in those other voices, you're going to want to throw in some more 16th notes here and there. So then this doesn't just seem random. Of course, if you want it to be random, if that's the end product that you want, well then that's what you're going to want to do. You're going to want to do something random. Okay, now I'm going to fill in one more. We have half notes this time, and I'm going to be in minor. So I'm going to choose C minor. One of the reasons is sometimes people think writing for minor is more difficult, and although it can be, it doesn't have to be, especially if you're just writing a Cantus Firmus here. So we're just thinking about C minor, so let's think again, tonic triad. We're going to have C, E, G. Okay, well, we're probably pretty used to writing in C major, so all we got to think is C, E, G. And furthermore, if we do want to think 4 or 5, well, right off the bat, we probably think F is 4, G is 5, right off the bat. You may not know your other keys as well. You may not know C major, but oftentimes a lot of people know C major pretty well. Okay, and also with this, I'm going to write this one in the bass. So it's going to be a given melody, but in the bass. And with that, I'm going to think about that idiomatically for the register it's in, and think, okay, the other one was a given melody that I wrote in sort of the soprano, are in the middle and upper registers of the treble staff. So with that, I had a lot more movement. I had a lot more stepwise motion and also faster notes, because I want you to hear that. I want it to stick out. I want it to be creative and interesting. And not to say that I want the bass to not be interesting and creative, but I might want to tone down some of that to lead some more interest for the upper voice. Okay, so I'm going to start in the bass, and I'm going to start C minor, tonic triad, and since I'm starting with the bass, in counterpoint, your first note is going to be that tonic note. Of course, this is because this is your very lowest note that you're placing. You're not going to write anything below this, and we also want to signify the key that we're using. Of course, there's many clever things that you could come up with that differ from this, but I'm trying to teach the basic foundational approaches, and from that, you can go and experiment and be creative. So again, I'm going to start half notes, and I'm just going to write half notes because this is going to be a half note cantus. Okay, now I'm going to change this to a 4/4 time signature since I want to do half notes, and it was a 3/4 before, which might be kind of interesting to do half notes and then have notes suspending, but I kind of wanted to keep this simple, and I really don't know how that's going to turn out, so I'm going to keep it simple. I'm going to start off with, of course, the tonic, and I'm just going to highlight the tonic triad. So I'm going to go up to an E. After that, you probably think I'm going to do a G, but instead of that, I'm going to go back down to a C. And then from there, I'll go to the G. So there we have the first two measures pretty strongly highlighting that tonic triad. And again, I'm leaping all over the place, but I'm going to fill it in with some more notes. But furthermore, I probably want to add in the foundation some things that are a little closer. So with it all in mind, I'm just going to now go down a few steps. There we have 3 notes that are all a step apart. So I'll leap down to a B, which is also the 7th of the tonic, or the leading tone in other words. So from there, I'll go up to the tonic. So it kind of acts like the leading tone. And then from there, I'm going to go down to G, which is the 5th of the tonic. Again, I'm not putting too much significance in this, but I'm just thinking the fact that, okay, these are notes that fit in the tonic, and it's just going to help the listener recognize that this is in C minor. From here, I'll go up 2 more steps again, kind of follow the thing where I had 3 steps in a row. Now I have that again, and now I kept the palettes open there. Let me close that. I'm so used to having that open, I kind of forgot that I opened that there, because I'm actually just used to seeing that normally. Okay, so let's look where we're at. We're at a B, which technically is the 7th scale degree. But let's think about what chord B could belong to. And of course, the 5th scale degree is always going to include the 7th scale degree as its 3rd. So I could just think about chord 5, which we probably know C enough to know that's going to be G. Okay, now I'm just going to go up a 3rd to D, because it'll solidify that chord a little more. I now have a G, a B, and a D. Okay, now I just highlighted chord 5. Why don't I highlight chord 4? Okay, so think about highlighting F, A, C, or probably at least F and C, because when you have the 5th, you know, okay, that's going to be that chord. If you just have the 3rd, you don't know, is there going to be another note below that? So I'm going to shoot for an F and a C at least, hopefully an F, A, and C. So if I go down a step, I have the C. Then if I just leap up a 4th from there, then I have the F. And then from there, I could always label that if I want. So I could say, okay, here in this measure, I have G chord. I also have a G chord in the next measure. And here I could be thinking about this as an F chord. That way, so later when I fill in the other notes, embellish this, or harmonize it and write other notes above it, then I'm going to know at least what I intended on doing. And again, when you actually start to do things, you might change it up, but it's just the fact that you had these ideas. And you're not going to have to think twice about them. You wrote a little note to remind you. I didn't fill in the last note because I didn't really know where I was going to go with this. I didn't know if I wanted to end high or down low, and I kind of wanted to write the foundation to this melody, the half notes, before I figured out where I wanted to end. Okay, so I'm just going to follow it. So it starts off towards the middle of the bass staff, starts to go up towards the top, it makes its way back down, and then it goes towards the bottom. Makes its way through the middle. Now it's going towards the upper middle. Okay, so we're going up and down again, which adds some interest and allows notes to be in different parts of the register. So you're not just hearing everything stay in the same place. But with this, again, like the last one, instead of just going up and down and up and down and up and down, why don't we kind of stay where we are now? Okay, so with that, writing in the bass, we want to end on the tonic, of course. And, well, thinking I'm just going to end in middle C here. It might seem kind of high for the bass voice, but you don't know where the notes above it might be. They might be way above this, or something interesting that happens is maybe one of the voices might merge into this note to where you might just have, let's say, a 3-voice cadence. You originally had 4 voices, and maybe the bass and the tenor both move stepwise into this final note. And again, I'm going to think about my cadence right now. So I did a bass cadence in the bass voice before. I did a soprano cadence in the soprano cadence before. And I can use these however I want. So I might be kind of tempted to say, okay, I want to do a soprano cadence now in the bass voice. But in fact, I think the soprano cadence is called soprano cadence and the bass cadence is called a bass cadence for a reason. And that's if you want a very strong ending, in other words, your actual perfect authentic cadence, you oftentimes are going to want that 5-to-1 in the bass and that 7-to-1 in the soprano. The 7-to-1 just works perfectly in the soprano, and the 7-to-1 can be a little bit weak in the bass voice, especially if other voices are drowning it out a little bit. And if you have the 5-to-1, it's a much larger leap for 1, but it's a very strong pull towards the tonic having the 5-to-the-1, and it just makes it a little more bold than the 7-to-1 in the bass. At least that's in my opinion. So with all that, I'm gonna think, okay, well, I probably don't want to be above this, because then I'll be way up in the treble staff. That's kind of getting ridiculous there. So instead, why don't I go down a fourth, which would be the inversion of the fifth above this. In other words, we have the note G, which is the fifth of the tonic. And then we go up to the tonic. So we go up a fourth from the 5 scale degree to the 1 scale degree. Again, I'm just going to label it just so I remember. Okay, I did a 5-to-1 there. And funny enough, if we see the notes surrounding this now have a gap, those notes are just a step apart. So now what am I going to do? In this case, I'm actually going to add a B, which is the leading tone. And I'm thinking that this is going to have a pull towards the tonic. So you're going to hear the B. And with how I'm going to write this, you're going to hear it slow down towards the end. So you might think, okay, we might go up to the tonic now. But with that, it's going to go down to the G. And then from there, it's going to go to the tonic. So that might add a little bit of suspense, or it might just add for a more clear ending because you have that very clear pull towards the tonic, and then you have the tonic. Furthermore, the notes B and G are going to fit in chord 5. So I'm not just going to be thinking about as the leading tone. It will function as the leading tone in here, but it's going to be functioning in a chord tone in the 5th chord of the scale that we're using. Okay, so I'm probably going to keep that second to last measure how it is. I might add something else, who knows. But from there, now I can embellish these half notes. So again, like I was saying, you might not want to make the bass move too much and be too stepwise or melodic because you're trying to have your melody be melodic. Most likely, maybe you do want a melodic bass line. That is something oftentimes people do. So if you're going for that, then you'll keep that in mind. But I'm just going to do a bass line that's a little more average, just something that's going to add support to what's going to be above it. And I don't want this to be boring. I still want this to be able to serve as its own individual line, to where if I go back and I listen to it, I say, okay, it has some interest, it has some melody, you can follow it, and you're not just sitting there sleeping. It's not just a bunch of quarter note and half notes all on the strong beats, but you actually have some interest in there. Okay, so let's keep all these things in mind. And with that, right here in the first measure, I have my 2 half notes. And instead of thinking about spicing it up and adding anything else, I'm just going to keep that how it is. I could always add some more interesting stuff, at least in the soprano voice, or in the voices above it. Okay, now here I'm in the second measure. And again, I want to make this a little interesting. I don't want to just do everything super strictly or anything. I just want to write some music here. But I'm also going to think about chords and whatnot while I'm doing this. Of course, this is counterpoint. But I see this leap of a 5th here. Okay, and I know I was highlighting the C chord. So I have the C and the G. Why don't I add some interest in there? And instead of you seeing the C and the G, now it goes down to a B. And again, this is all just a template for what will be written above it. So adding some interesting stuff here already in the bass is just going to be a good thing to do. So I started with the half notes kind of slow. I have the quarter notes, and I could get into some 8th notes and kind of make this more melodic. And here's one of my philosophies in life. Part of me wants to add some 8th notes and make it more melodic. The other part of me is saying, well, no, this is a bass line, so I don't want it to be too melodic. So why don't I combine both of those and go somewhere in the middle? Like I've been saying, it's often good to not just go straight into the 8th notes, and here I am on the strong beat 3. So I'll make this a quarter note, and then I'll add some 8th notes to embellish. And the reason why I'm saying embellish this is because I'm just going to be doing a neighboring tone, where I'm going to be leaping down to this E and then back up to the G. So it's basically just embellishing this G note. And again, if I start to think too hard about chords and stuff here, I might think, oh, I don't want to do this and I don't want to do that. And if you are going for a certain end product with certain chords, maybe you will think like that. Or just writing a given melody here. And if you start to add some more kind of spice already in your given melody, then you're going to just not only end up with a more complex end product, but you're going to have more of a challenge when writing it. And you're going to have to come up with some more interesting things compared to if you just make it easy for yourself. Okay, so we see we had the half notes. We're going into the quarter notes. We start to pick up. We have some 8th notes now. Again, we're here in the very beginning I want the listener to know what time signature we're in, so I'm going to make sure that this first note is going to be a quarter note. After this, I'm pretty sure I do want this leap in between the E and the B here, so I'm just going to move it, shift it over there. Now I'm thinking about adding some eighth notes here in the middle. Okay, so I just went down to a C and then an A with these eighth notes. And what I'm thinking here is I started with the F, so now I have an F, A, C, the fourth chord, and then we see two more eighth notes. We see the B and the C, and the C leaps up to an E, so not really sure how I want to look at that. Do I want to look at the B and the C as an interval and a chord? Do I want to look at the C and the E as an interval and a chord? And these are questions that you'd ask yourself when you're harmonizing this. But for now, I'm just doing the given melody, and I'm just embellishing the single line. So I'm going to keep going. We do see some stepwise movement, and then in the next measure, there's a leap, so I want to keep that. I'm going to again start off this measure with a quarter note to have that full first beat, and then I'm going to shift that other note over towards the end as a placeholder, because I don't know where I want that, but I probably do want this note. It was at least the foundation. I might delete it completely. Let's see. So there's something interesting here, and it's that in my second measure, I have the 3/4 notes, 2 eighth notes. In my third measure, I have a quarter note and 4 eighth notes. Something in this next measure, why not follow this and add another 2 eighth notes? So then I'll have 6 eighth notes in a row. I kept this pretty simple. I just did an arpeggio of C, E, G, and then I went down a step. So then we had the F, D, and then a C. How exactly would I harmonize that? I'm not sure. I would at least look at the first note there, which I have a G. I'd probably pay attention to the note here as well, which is a D. So looking at that, I'd probably harmonize it with A, G, B, and D. And I'd probably figure out how to deal with those other notes in there. Okay, moving on to the next measure, we see there's the G and there's also the notes where these next two measures are G and F from the foundation of the notes that I put, which of course can always change. I'm going to start off with a quarter note after this stream of these eighth notes here. I keep doing a lot of leaps in between measures. So this time, instead of doing a leap in between these two measures here, I might have just changed the format a little bit. I'm just going to do a step. And because of that, beats 1 and 4 here are already filled out and they're a step away. So now I need to have these middle notes do something interesting and somehow end up to where it's going to work. I thought what else would be more perfect than doing a C, E, and G again, then with that sixth after that above the tonic. So there's that ambiguity of, is this the tonic chord or is this chord 3? And in the measure before, I had a C, E, G there too. So it's sort of echoing that a little bit. Also, it's going down quite low. And for a bass voice, oftentimes, instead of having a high point, you're going to have a low point. So here I am with my low point. We also do see, looking forward, we're ending up here at middle C. We're going to have to figure out a way to get up there, and hopefully not just go right up there, or up, down, but do something interesting. It's a good time to now look at what we've done so far. Start in the middle, went down, went up towards the top, kind of hovered there a little bit. It leaps down towards the bottom, kind of floats up towards the middle again. Then we kind of have some middle to upper, kind of like a wave. And then here's where we have the low point. Now it goes way down low. Now it's going up high. I think instead of just escaping this low point, I'm going to want to stick around this low point for at least another measure, and then I'm going to want to bring myself up higher so I can make my way towards the ending. And with this, I wanted to highlight the chord G in this next measure, and like I was saying, these are just placeholders. I don't have to stay true to what I wrote, so I'm going to take note that I had a B there, but instead I'm going to do a G with a quarter note, and then I'll go up to a B, and then from there I'm just going to do a scalar run, or a run of notes that are all in stepwise, just 4 of them. So I had the G and the B, and then I went to the D, and then I go up including the 6th and the 7th, and then I go back up to the octave. So it's really just highlighting that G chord. From there, the G leaps down to a C. I'm going to keep that how it is. So of course I'm going to change that beat 1 to a quarter note. So I'm probably going to keep this second to last measure with these half notes. So again, I'm going to move this note over towards the end. Here are the placeholder of notes that I had, but now I have a quarter note in the beginning and end of my third to last measure, and I have a half note's rest worth of notes to fill in. So I want to highlight the F chord, and I don't need to put all 3 chord tones like I've been doing a lot throughout this, because this is the bass. I could always write a lot more above this. And we could see I said I wasn't really going to make a melodic bass line, but I do have a lot of movement here. But it's good to note that it really matters what I write above it. What I write above it could be a bunch of eighth notes for the most part. The slow notes might be the quarter notes, and then there's 16th notes for the fast notes. So this might still serve as a perfectly good bass line that's still not a melodic bass line. I really like eighth notes, so here I am with all these eighth notes. Okay, so I'm tempted to leap up to an A here, so I have an F, A, and a C, but with what I just said in mind, I'm thinking, well, I don't really need to actually highlight every single chord tone because I could do those chord tones in the notes above it. I already have a C and I have an F, so that's why I want to include the A, but now I'm thinking, well, what else could I do? And one thing is, if I add a D in here, then all of a sudden it's going to add some interest in saying, okay, well, I have a D, an F, and a C. And so if I do end up adding that A, then I'm going to have a DFA possibly, which is a D chord, although in the beginning of the measure I do start on the C. So in that case, it could be two different chords. They could combine together to where the D is a D7th chord now, with the D and then FAC above it. So there's a lot of things to actually think about this technically with chords. Again, I don't want to overthink it when thinking about chords, and I just want to write enough notes to where when I respond, it's going to be interesting. And I'm going to add some stuff, like some notes that you probably wouldn't if you were just doing strict chord tones throughout the entire thing, which will just make it more interesting. Okay, and I'm paying attention also note durations. Second to last measure, I see eighth notes. Here I see quarter notes, and I like the notes that I have. So I'm thinking about doing some eighth notes here. And I often don't like to just start at some place, go down, and go right back up to it. But in this case, I'm going to go up here to the F. I'm going to go down a step. So we have the E going to the D, and then that's going to leap up a third again to the F. Okay, and I think because there's a leap there, it's not just going straight down and straight up. That's one thing. And then also I haven't done anything like that throughout this entire thing. So here's something that's a little different compared to what else was written before. So we have certain points where we're going down leaps pretty drastically. We're recovering from that. We have some scalar lines that are bringing us up to the registers up higher pretty quickly. We have some areas that are keeping us in the same area where we started and where we're ending. Okay, so we have some interest throughout this entire thing, and there's some certain things that we see in one place, we see them again in another place. It's very helpful. And again, you're going to write notes above this. So if there's some things that seem kind of random, well, you could include them in your other voices when you're writing those. For now, I'm pretty happy with what I wrote. This is the given melody bass line in C minor. And of course, you could start thinking harmonic minor and melodic minor and add your accidentals and stuff, which I think is great. But I recommend thinking about harmonic and melodic minor after you wrote your other notes. You might disagree, you might have a different method, you might think about it as you're writing it the whole time, but for me, I like to really write the notes, write the music and the notes that I want to write, that I want to express, and then from there say, would it make sense to further add the harmonic minor, make it more solidified as that harmonic minor, and to add things like the dominant fifth, the half diminished chord that's built off chord 7, which in a harmonic minor actually turns into a fully diminished chord since you're altering that last note. Okay, so because of that, I'm just going to keep this how it is, and if I were to add the accidentals to make a melodic or harmonic minor, I'm probably going to do that after I wrote all the notes and I'm happy with it. For now, let's give this a listen. Okay, there we have it. It's good to note that it had some interest by itself, and it's really good when you're thinking about counterpoint to have each line have some interest. Of course, you get into the middle lines, they might be a little more boring, but you never want to make them too boring. And also goes for the player. The player doesn't want to just play one note the whole piece. Add some interest for the player too. I don't have the response video for the last 3 voice, but I do have all the responses, and if someone wants to see a response video, just leave that in the comments and I will make that video. Otherwise, I probably won't make that video. I've already made plenty of response videos and they're very helpful, but they're pretty boring, and it's better to probably have a little fun actually writing something, getting some practice that way. Okay, so I've gone through all the boring stuff. Now I'm going to get into some more stuff like actually just free composing, but I am going to have a series of 4-part counterpoint videos that I will have the different species as well as some different methods of writing for voices, analyzing, and also labeling what's going on, keeping track of everything. Okay, so I have a series of some videos for 4-voice counterpoint. I have 3 videos in mind. And they're going to be 3 really good videos, and they're going to be completely different, so look out for those. And those will be my last of the actual counterpoint videos for said voices and species. After that, I still will tie in counterpoint in a lot of my videos, whether I'm writing about music, talking about music, or maybe even analyzing music. So it'll still be a said theme, and I'll have a bunch of videos on my channel in case people have questions in those videos in the future. So let's get into writing the cantus, the 8th note cantus. In this first one here, we're going to highlight the tonic triad of B flat major, because we see we're in B flat major, which could also be G minor, but we're going to make this easy and just stay in a major key. And if you're not so familiar with reading both the treble and the bass, whether that is separately or here with the piano, sing them together, well, now's a good time to practice that. Okay, so I'm going to start off here in the bass line, and I'm going to go a very conventional approach here, especially in the first one. So I'm going to start with a slower beginning, and of course I'm going to start with the first note that's in the key, and also that tonic triad. Okay, and of course that would be my B flat. If you're not really used to scoring for different keys, maybe you do MIDI, just know a helpful tip is that you see here the key signature tells you what flats, so I don't have to think about B flat or E flat. It's good to know that, but you see in the key signature it already tells me that. I just know that I'm working with the key of B flat, and I'm, because of that, going to have B as my tonic chord, 4th is going to be E, the 5th is going to be F, and the 7th is going to be A. Of course, the E is going to be an E flat, the B is going to be a B flat, but that's already written there, and I don't need to think about that when I'm writing for this, okay? I'm just thinking about, okay, certain chords, and I could think real simple here, like mostly highlighting a 1, 4, 5. And I know people laugh at that, and they say, oh, people think that the basic theory classes say you got to write the 1, 4, and 5s, blah, blah, blah. Just know it's very helpful. And if you do a lot of score reading of a lot of German composers, you're going to see a common thing is that they highlight 1, 4, and 5 a whole lot, and they do a lot of things around that, whether that's going to the secondary dominant of the 4 or the 5, or oftentimes using a minor chord in the key to use that as a pivot chord and do a secondary dominant, or an interesting device that is often found is a major chord, if that's, let's say, the tonic of the piece, and the minor chord acts as a subdominant in a different key. And all that has to do is the minor chord in any key goes up a full step, and then you have the dominant of a minor key. Because in any minor key, you have a minor subdominant to a major dominant. So if you go up a full step to a major and make it a dominant, you can treat that like a 4-5. You can resolve it back to the 1. Okay? In all, 1-4-5 is not only very useful, it's very common. Okay, so don't laugh at it. We're going to practice 1, 4, and 5 in this one. Okay, so we're going to have the B flat, of course. So yeah, I just put this in 6-8. So actually I'm going to change this into a dotted quarter note, just so it gives off those 3 beats. And then for the next note, I will do a D. But just to start this off a little more interesting, instead of just going right off the bat to another dotted quarter note, I'm just going to do some 8th notes. Give it some more interest right in the beginning. And I'm thinking just doing simple passing note with the E and highlighting that D and that F. So now we have B, D, F. We have that B chord there in that first measure. Now my goal for the second measure is going to be the first half is going to be the B chord still, whether that might be in a different inversion. I'm going to highlight those notes in that chord. And then the second part of the measure, I want to do either the 4 or the 5, whichever one is closer. And of course, I'm not actually writing with the piano right here. I'm just doing the mouse on the computer, but I'm gonna think like, okay, if I'm writing for the piano, okay, so here's what I ended up with. After the dotted quarter note and the 3/8 notes, I followed that in the second measure, and then I followed some 8th notes for an entire measure after that. So we're still playing off notes we've heard before. We've seen a stream of 3/8 notes already, and now we just have 2 of them in this measure, and then we have another dotted quarter note in the beginning of this 4th measure here. And then after that, we see a large leap, some 8th notes, but we see some 16th notes mixed within that. So things start to get faster. We also have a climax. We have our highest note of the melody so far, and it is the highest note of the entire melody. It's just simple 8 or 9 measures. And then we can see after that some more 16th notes, but then it slows down towards the end with some large leaps in the register, kind of telling us, okay, we're going way down low, we're going up a little bit higher, and then we're ending. And we also do see a soprano cadence here in the bass. which is just a 7 to 1. So we see the A going to the B flat, which is the leading tone going to the tonic. Again, if you pay attention, for the most part, I highlighted the notes B, D, and F in the most important, like beginning of a measure, beginning of the beats, which here I'm thinking of 2 pulses of 3 notes. So in those 2 pulses of 3 notes, for the most part, I'm going to be B, D, F, or other than that, A, which is the 7th of that chord. We do see some ambiguity. Other than that, I don't stay strict to that, but for the most part, that's what I do, and that helps write it, helps inspire it, and it helps give coherence to the key that I'm in. We see I didn't modulate at all. The whole point of this was doing an 8th note cantus. Oh, and I didn't do that at all. Oh my gosh. Whoops. It's supposed to be 8th note cantus. Okay, so I didn't stay true to the 8th note cantus. I got a little carried away, just actually trying to stick with some things that I already wrote, but I was supposed to do the 8th note cantus. It's always good to make a mistake. There's no problem with that as long as you learn. So next time, I'm going to stay true to the cantus idea. We can still see that I wrote a cantus here. Okay, now we're going to think about an arpeggiated cantus. We're going to be in a 5/4 time signature though, kind of weird, and we're going to do an arpeggiated cantus. So this time with the arpeggios, I want to put it more in the soprano. So I'm going to be writing here in the treble, and with the arpeggiated cantus, that's the rule here. It's not like I have to do any certain notes like the last one I was supposed to do, the 8th notes, but it was still a good learning lesson. I'm going to try to highlight E, and we're doing a 5/4 here, so it's kind of weird. I'm just going to start off highlighting that 5/4. So I'm going to do 5 different beats. Okay, so I have the B, of course, because I'm starting above. I don't technically have to start on the actual tonic because I could put that below when I start to harmonize this. So you think about, okay, what note do I want to start on? In this case, I have my tonic of E, G, and B. So instead of starting on E or G, I'm going to actually do the 5th. So I'm going to start B right there in the middle of the treble clef. So at my 5 notes, I did the B, I did what was thinking like a passing tone here to that G, and then I went to the E. So we have the E, G, B, we have the E chord highlighted, and then I just went up to an A. Again, I wanted to highlight the fact that there was these 5 notes in this measure. It's an odd time signature. Okay, so I have my first 5 notes. I started with the B, I went down just to a G and then to the E, so it's a descending triad of E major, E, G, B. After establishing that, I thought, okay, I want to do either the 4 or the 5 here, and I did an A and a C, which we have A, which would be A, C, and E for the 4th, the subdominant, so that's why I chose those notes. Also, it's the arpeggiated cantus, so I'm thinking of just doing arpeggios here. Okay, here's what I came up with for this one. It was interesting with the arpeggios. I didn't do any passing tones, any dissonant devices. It's just arpeggios and, if anything, chord tones. Okay, so let's listen to this one. Okay, so kind of weird, but it's the 5/4, so I kind of wanted to make it weird. I wanted to experiment, and when you experiment, it might turn out kind of weird, but you learn a lot. And I learned some things maybe I want to do, maybe I don't want to do, maybe some things I want to look out for. It's good to experiment. And also, I'm not spending too much time on this currently, and basically how much time you spend, how seriously you take it, is then going to influence your outcome. Okay, and you'll notice for the most of it, I highlighted the tonic chord, and then I did some chords that are chords 4 and 5, and then I tried to do clever things like finding certain notes in certain chords and then blending those with the notes in other chords, and this is what I came up with as a result. So just some ideas, and you can write your own cantus pretty simply. The whole point of this is you write your own cantus and you make your own responses. Okay, we're going to wrap this all up by listening to parallel fifths and parallel octaves. First, we're just going to listen to a piano playing parallel fifths. We see the difference in the registers. First, they are within the octave, a fifth apart. Then they're an octave away, a fifth apart. And then they spread out further in the octaves. Just to show you what that sounds like, it's one good thing to keep in mind that often people say your upper voices can have your parallel fifths and octaves, and that's fine, but you don't want it between your bass voice and any other voice. So if you're thinking about figured bass, any interval that would show up in your figured bass, because of course you're building your intervals off your bass voice. Some people take it a step further and say you don't want any parallel fifths or octaves between any voice and your soprano voice, especially if your soprano does a leap. So that's where people get extra strict. You may not care if the soprano does a leap or not. And then some people take it even a step further and they're super strict and they say, okay, no parallel fifths or octaves in any voices. And that would probably be inspired by someone like Bach, because if you look at a lot of Bach scores, there's no parallel fifths or octaves in any voice, oftentimes. But, I mean, if you look at enough of Bach's pieces, you'll see it sometimes he literally has parallel fifths. And like Well-Tempered Clavier or something, or in other pieces you'll find it. If you doubt me, I'll show you proof. Okay, but not only are we going to listen to it in piano, then we're going to listen to it in the violin and viola, so you'll hear it in strings, and then we'll hear the same thing in octaves. So I want to include all these differences in the register, but it's probably really good to pay attention to the parallel fifths and octaves that are going to be further in the register, more towards the end you see here. But if you're going to be thinking really strictly, maybe you want to know the sound of parallel fifths and octaves in all these different registers. Okay, so now let's give it a listen. Okay, so there were the parallel fifths and octaves. The biggest thing is, why do you avoid parallel fifths and octaves? If you do not know, it has to do with the physics, the overtone series. Any vibrating object in the air that is emitting certain wavelengths, certain frequency, and that's where we get notes from. We have our vibrating strings, whether you have a violin and a viola here, and the bow is going across the string, it's vibrating, you're getting a sound. Or you have a piano and the hammers plucking the strings and you have a sound. The string is a vibrating object in the air. It's resonating certain frequencies out. You hear the note. And if you look up a guitar string and you look at guitar string on its side or something like that, and you'll get a view of a guitar string, and you'll see that if you basically get a guitar, and instead of looking down at the strings, but you place your guitar down, let's say on a table, and you're looking through your strings, then you'll see that instead of your strings vibrating like you might expect, they're actually sort of doing circles, like a jump rope, which funny enough is what a sine wave is representing, is a circular pattern. And it's graphed out through a sine wave, but you can think about the sine waves of musical notes, and then when you look at a guitar string, you can actually see the spinning. So it's almost like you could see those sine waves in action. You'll notice that the string in its entirety is vibrating a lot faster in the center, and as it gets further out, it's not vibrating as fast. Of course, logically, where you pluck it, it's vibrating more intensely. It starts to ease off when it gets away from that. But the effect of this is fractions of the tone that you were plucking, ratios of that initial tone that you were plucking, which creates overtones. There are certain specific ratios, and depending on what instrument you're playing will tell you and how accurately it actually does something called mode interlocking, where basically the overtones fit in the harmonic series. Things get pretty complicated when you get into certain instruments, like for example the clarinet's family's overtones only has odd-numbered overtones. So some weird things start to happen. But on a very basic level, you have these overtones. The first overtone is the octave, and that is the strongest and loudest, most heard overtone. The second overtone is the fifth, and that is a fifth away from the octave then. So if you have a C note you're going to have a C above that, an octave. A fifth above that octave is your next overtone. So it's an octave and a fifth away from your first note. Then you have a fourth built on that, which a fourth built over a fifth over your tonic brings you right back to your tonic. So now you're 2 octaves away from your starting note, or an octave plus a fifth plus a fourth. It keeps going, and you go to major third, and then you have minor third, and basically in the entirety of it, you have octave, fifth, and major third are your first overtones. So your very first overtones of a note create a major chord. This is why a lot of people theorize that the major scale and the major chord is something that we naturally resonate with. It is naturally in the harmonic series. Furthermore, leading to the fact that we may have not created the musical scales and such, but we more have just figured out the physics of the overtone series. And then we also created equal temperament, which allowed us to modulate to a lot of different keys without having trouble. But basically that's the point of avoiding your octave and your fifth. Those are your first 2 overtones. They're heard the loudest. So if you start to have parallel octaves, then it's easy to drown that note out, to not be able to hear that note, because it is the note that is the overtone above the note below it. And then the second one's the fifth. So it's the second worst, basically. So that's why they say don't do parallel fifths, don't do parallel octaves. It has to do with counterpoint. You want to be able to hear each of the voices. So of course this rule fits very distinctly into classical style music, contrapuntal style music. That's the only time you're going to follow this rule. Parallel fifths and parallel octaves sound perfectly fine. You might have noticed they actually sound kind of cool. Some of these intervals and these leaps of these parallel fifths and octaves might have reminded you of certain songs. So don't be afraid of your parallel fifths and your octaves if you're not writing contrapuntal music. If you are, then a lot of times people aren't so strict in the upper voices so much, and you need to do a lot of experimenting and see for yourself. If you're going to write piano music, it's going to be different than if you're writing chamber music. It's going to be even different if you're writing chamber music with wind instruments than if you're writing chamber music with stringed instruments. If you start to add the piano in there, and then if you start to go more into symphonic pieces, and then you take it the next step, you start to go into more vocal pieces. Let's say you're writing a chorale or something. All these different scenarios are going to have different instruments, so to say, with their different timbres, which are each going to express the overtones in different ways, at different amplitudes. And like I said with the clarinet family, sometimes the overtones will be different than other instruments. So if you really are going to be serious with this, you're going to have to write a lot of music, and you're going to have to know what to do in each scenario, when you can do what in each scenario, and of course come up with your own opinions, and that's how you're going to end up with your own writing style. So that's it for this video. There's going to be a lot more coming out. Subscribe to see more. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like it, maybe share it on social media so other people can see it too. And until next time, take care. Goodbye.